Okay, we're recording now. No, so
Okay.
I'm going to give you the host back.
All right.
Try clicking through your slides just one time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're still sharing. And so I'm going to keep the host mode in case I need to do anything else. And you can still do everything that you're doing. And
That's fine. Sure.
okay, thank you. Like 6 more minutes still.
Okay.
So are you able to send me the slides after the session? And
Sure.
so we can share it with the participants on as a PDF. I'll turn the file into a PDF.
Yes, of course. And actually, there are some links at the end for
Okay.
both university resources and outside resources too.
That's
So that would be
perfect.
great.
Yeah, and then we can use that to populate the teaching continuity site where
Yeah,
we're creating an area just for accessibility. So that'll be
that's
great.
great. Okay, good.
Good morning. I have a question if it is okay.
Yes, of course.
I want to know if like after today's workshop or training or presentation, is that possible for your office to issue the participant email to like kind of, we can, in the future, we can put in our FPT, like we participate this training, things like that.
I lost your audio for a moment. So if it's possible for our office to send to the participants an email can you repeat the information you're needing?
Yeah, so for example, before when I participate the training from Teaching Excellence Center, they will send us an email say, okay, like thank you for participating this training. So then, for example, like my department is really like they really want to see those kind of email to prove you very much involved in those trainings, and then we can put in FPT. So.
Yes, of course. So what we are working on is to be able to send any one of our faculty members who has participated in faculty development sessions throughout this academic year to be able to receive a memo of attendance from our offices combined, Faculty Success and the Center for Teaching Excellence, detailing the sessions that the faculty member attended throughout the academic year. We are planning on getting this done throughout the month of June in order to be able to get this to everyone. Would that work for you?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so it's 10 a.m. We're going to get started. It's okay. We have more faculty coming in. We had over 60 faculty members sign up for our session today. So we are hoping to see many more join us very soon. Right now I'm showing 32 participants in this session. I'm very happy to see that, and very happy to see all of you this morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Claudia Garcia, and I work with the Office of Faculty Success and Diversity. I think I've met many of you, and I'm happy to see you today. Feel free to turn on your camera, your video. We welcome that. We are very happy to see you. So if you're able to, go ahead and do that right now. You're welcome to keep your mics on mute, but you can also unmute if there are any disruptions on your end. Of course, we invite you to mute it back on so that we don't have any interruptions with the video, particularly because we are recording the session. I also wanted to again remind you of this so that then you can go back to it and reference any information. We are also making the video available through our CTE website on the teaching continuity site, particularly where we are posting the videos of all of the development sessions we've done for faculty that cannot join us live throughout the sessions, so that they can also participate and benefit from all the information we're providing. Please make sure that you are showing your first name and last name on when you sign in. If you did that, great. If not, you still have a chance to change that. It is important so that we can register your attendance, as well as reference you if you have a particular question or we need to follow up with you afterwards regarding a request. You can still change that if you look in your bar. If you hover over your screen, at the bottom of it, you should have the Zoom toolbar. So under Manage Participants, if you click on that, you'll find a box with everyone who's joining us today. Go ahead and look for your name or the username that you used to sign in, and then you can still change that. You can type over it and show your first name and your last name. That way we can register your attendance, and we're able to then give you that memo of attendance later this summer. Okay. I think that's all for my reminders. I don't need to tell anybody where the restrooms are right now. I would usually do that in all the sessions, but you know that better than I do now. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. I'm very happy to have Antonia Paulette with us. She's the Director for Student Accessibility Services. And I'm proud to be part of this collaboration with Tonya, with Francisco Garcia and Colt, and then with our CTE Director, Alisa Cavazos, and our Fellow for Technology Education, Elena Venegas, in putting together a series of sessions regarding student accessibility. There are many new things that we're learning throughout this this health crisis, and this is one where we think we can help and contribute to assist you in serving our students, all of our students. So this would be the first of a few sessions that we're going to offer. We are going to have some hands-on type of workshops later on in collaboration with Colt. We're also working on a section within the teaching continuity site where you'll find resources specifically for accessibility. So be on the lookout for that. Today, we are starting with this session, which we have titled a quick start for accessibility in online or remote courses. With that, I'm going to leave it to Tonya to introduce the session for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. Well, it's wonderful to be here with everyone today, even though it's virtual, which seems to be our new normal, and we hear that word a lot too. But I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk about accessibility and how important and necessary it is in the online environment as well as face-to-face courses. So, okay, here we go. So I do think it's important for us just to reference very quickly the changes that we are experiencing. As you all know, changes are happening very quickly. We're in the middle of a fluid situation. We don't have clear expectations for what will happen next. And I think those kinds of things are important not only for faculty's personal experiences, but also for our students. And as a matter of fact, I participated in a webinar recently, and they talked about faculty needing to conduct emergency delivery of course content. And I thought that was a really great description because I realized that's more or less what's happened during this spring semester. It's been emergency delivery because it's moved into a different format. I think one of the keys, though, to this emergency delivery was making sure that course content was functional and accessible for the widest range of students possible. We'll be talking about some strategies that are used for accessibility for a wide range of students as well as in particular for students with disabilities. And so the other thing I want to emphasize before we start today is that Student Accessibility Services, or SAS, is a resource for students with disabilities, but it's also a resource for faculty. Anytime faculty have questions about accessibility or accommodations in their academic courses, we really encourage faculty to reach out to us. We can have one-on-one conversations about particular students' accommodations or even just accessibility in general. So please use us as a resource. That's what we're here for. So today, the objectives of this session will be to learn about factors affecting students during the current pandemic and the barriers that are encountered by students with disabilities in online environments. We also want to improve understanding of your role in assisting students with disabilities, the accommodation process, and then the resources available for your support. Okay. So some of the factors that are affecting our students at this point, and I speak of this broadly because it's all students. Many students have issues with access to technology and internet. If you think about it, some of our students are sharing computers in their home environments. Some of them may have very limited access to a computer if there is one shared by the entire family. And then on top of that, there's network reliability issues. Some of our students are going to experience challenges with self-directed learning issues with time management and organizing themselves in an environment that doesn't have as much structure as if they were attending face-to-face classes as they were previously. The other thing for students to have to, I guess, figure out would be an appropriate location for learning. For some of our students in a home that has many members of the family, that can be a real challenge, especially if they're trying to find quiet locations, not only for learning, but for taking exams. The campus offers students many more opportunities sometimes than what a home environment would. Also, students managing their classes while dealing with additional stresses. I think that's probably the case for many of us and not just students, but they can be impacted by different factors such as financial, health, housing, food insecurity, safety, and even family concerns. Thinking about what if they have a family member who's ill and they have to take care of them. So thinking about that leads to also an increase in stress levels for many students. And so there's a strain on mental health, even if it's just because of remote learning, because of the shift to online if they've had face-to-face courses before, or even just being in an isolated situation. And then, of course, there's the challenges with Blackboard or even specific software that students are required to use with this new format of learning. Along with that, there could be potential limited options for some students when it comes to support, or maybe they don't know what the supports are that are available to them because they've never had to actually use them before. Now that they have moved online, it's a different environment. And then on top of all of this, there are disability-related barriers and even challenges. So there was recently a survey conducted by Active Minds, and it was conducted with a little over 3,000 students. Actually, 74% of those students that were surveyed were college students, and they were being surveyed about the impact of COVID-19 on their educational experiences. And I thought the findings were very relevant, especially since the survey results were just recently provided to the public. So 48% have experienced financial setbacks. I think that's consistent with what we've seen across our country. 20% reported having mental health significantly worsened. I think that's a very large number, but also not particularly unexpected. And then 85% reported struggling with focusing on school and work, very high number indeed. And then 48%, as I had mentioned, reported difficulty finding private or quiet space, which we know can be very important for the learning process. So some other ways that COVID-19 has impacted students, they reported things like being alone, lack of Wi-Fi, grading policies, and I think what that may be related to are the changes such as what we have currently, that students can select the pass-fail option at the end of the semester. That can be very confusing for students because then they're having to make decisions that they haven't had to make previously. And I think just the unknown, the uncertain can cause stress. Also mental health issues, and I bring that up because I think about our students who already have mental health conditions, and so this type of change to their everyday experience can potentially exacerbate their mental health condition. Some students reported missing even physical contact with others. We're having to isolate and separate and distance. Family issues that they're dealing with, maybe even, like I said, having to take care of family members. Some students are reporting abuse, unemployment, and then just things like not being able to meet their basic needs to pay rent and get food. So I share these things because not only is it assumed that these types of things are experiences of our students, but now we have some data to back that up, at least on about 3,000 college students, which I think is pretty reflective. Okay, so also part of the Active Minds survey, the number one concern reported by those students surveyed was academic support considerations by administrators. And what they were referring to were these three items: leniency, flexibility, and accommodations. I do think that that's very important and very telling that that's the number one concern reported by these students who were surveyed. The second, of course, being mental health supports, looking at what investments universities are putting into the supports related to counseling and coping, and then also soft skills. I was a little surprised by this, but once you think through it, I think it's pretty reasonable to consider that students are hoping to see empathy, compassion, understanding, and even validation of their current experience. So anytime that you can communicate using those soft skills with your students, I think it could go very far in supporting them. So a powerful tool for educational institutions, of course, is online learning, but I have to add the caveat that that is as long as it is accessible. Online learning environments have to be built to think about that widest variety of students, also students with disabilities, and finally, thinking about the assistive technology that students with disabilities might use, and this is particularly important in the online environment. And I think this could go without saying, but I'll just emphasize, accommodations are required for the purpose of access for students with disabilities. It's more than just, it's the right thing to do. There is a legal requirement for them to be implemented. So speaking of the legal requirements, what is accessible? Well, according to the Office of Civil Rights, and that's part of the U.S. Department of Education, it means a person with a disability is afforded opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability. Very important, these next words, in an equally effective and equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use. So in other words, the person with a disability must be able to obtain the information as fully, equally, and independently as a person without a disability. So who are the students that we serve and support their access at the university through accommodations? Of course, I've mentioned students with disabilities, but some may not be aware that we also support accommodation requests for students who are pregnant, who have a pregnancy-related condition, or those students who are seeking parenting accommodations. And just so you know, that typically is the 12 weeks immediate postpartum. So after the birth of the child, or pregnancy-related, meaning even an adoption or other types of conditions that would be related to becoming a parent. So typically it's the 12 weeks immediate following that condition. So because we need to talk about laws, I won't go in great detail, but I do just want you to be familiar with the two federal laws that address the rights of individuals with disabilities. These two are Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and it applies to entities that receive federal financial aid from the U.S. Department of Education. This particular law is enforced by the Office of Civil Rights. And then, of course, there's the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act. And Title II of the ADA does apply to public entities. It's enforced by the Office of Civil Rights and the U.S. Department of Justice. These are important to know because if a student has an issue where their course materials or their online environment, their learning environments are not accessible, they could reasonably file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights, and then we would have to address that complaint. So that's why I was saying earlier, it's more than just the right thing to do. It is something that we have an obligation to do as a post-secondary institution in order to provide accessible learning materials and technologies for students with disabilities. The other important note, and this is not to catch anyone off guard, but it's just for you to be aware. Not only can universities be named in these complaints, but also individual faculty and staff. So that's something to be aware of. Also, the reason that I say that Student Accessibility Services is a resource to faculty. So if there's ever any concerns about, am I implementing an accommodation correctly? I have concerns about how to meet the student's access needs, contact our office, because that's what we're there for. We can help provide some guidance in those situations. The other federal law that we have to be aware of is Title IX. Many people have heard about that, particularly as it relates to sexual harassment. But in this case, the Title IX applies to those students who are pregnant, have the pregnancy-related conditions, or parenting, and the accommodations that they are requesting. So I thought it might be helpful see the types of complaints that might be submitted for review by OCR and even federal courts. This is a recent example, which I think hits a lot of the concerns that many people have right now related to accessibility. And in this case, Payan and Mason versus Los Angeles Community College District, or LACCD, was a case that was filed in the Federal Central District of California, and this was just recent 19. It was on the basis of Section 504 and Title II of the ADA, which I had just mentioned. And in fact, this case was brought by the National Federation for the Blind on behalf of 2 students. And these are 2 students who are blind. Some of the complaints that were brought forth had to do with the platform we're using in their academic courses and them not being accessible. So one of the platforms that they were using was My Math Lab. And not only was it not fully accessible for these students who are blind, but the community college district did not provide an effective alternative for those students to use. Another important point that I thought that this case brought up was that students should have meaningful access to the course. And in this case, they emphasized timeliness. And in fact, the phrase that they used in the court documents was course materials needed to be provided to or prior to or at the same time as sighted students would receive them. That can sometimes be a challenge, and you may be familiar with this even with your own course materials. But if we've been provided a textbook, let's say through a publisher who said everything's accessible, and we have a student who is blind and potentially using a screen reader, as that student navigates through that particular textbook, they find that they are not able to access the information. We'll talk about that in a little bit, and I've given you some resources at the end of this so you can see how screen readers work if you're not familiar with that process. But in this case, if the textbook that has been assigned for the course is not accessible, even though possibly publishers said that then we as an institution are responsible for making all of the information accessible to those students. Student accessibility services can help with that, but I can tell you to edit a full textbook, even chapter by chapter, takes an inordinate amount of time. And so timeliness can really be a challenge in situations like that. So I also wanted to share with you that something that came out of this case was inaccessible instructor developed materials. And in this case, it was in particular a handbook that was provided to students in an abnormal psychology course. As OCR does, they typically look through these cases and evaluate them. They not only look at the student's individual specific complaint, but they look at maybe how other things at the university, the institution, are accessible. And in this case, they found some library databases that were not accessible. And so part of what they were saying was that effectively students were denied meaningful access to the benefits of the course where the student could not access My Math Lab, and a failure to make the course and institutional resources accessible constituted disability discrimination as a matter of law. So what does that mean for the institution? Well, obviously, the LACCD has some remediations that they'll have to take care of. And in this case, there were a number of those. But let me just highlight a couple. They had to remediate their website because there were some things on the website that were not accessible. They also had to designate a Dean of Educational Institutional Technology for the district, and that person would be responsible for enforcing accessibility policies, but as well as course materials accessibility. In addition, they were required to pay one of the students. Many times there are fees, and I guess you would say monetary payments that are given to the plaintiffs who make the complaint. And in this particular case, it was $40,000. But beyond that, there was also a request for attorney's fees, also costs associated with the case that were well over $2 million. So when you think about your courses being accessible, it is a requirement by law, and if a student were to find that materials and your course instruction even is not accessible, they can file a complaint. This can happen at the institutional level, but it can also happen at the federal level. And in this case, that's sort of a summary of the case. Just so you have some awareness of what that means when students file a complaint. So what does it mean for a course to be accessible? We've talked about how we want to, yes.
I'm sorry, I had my hand raised and
All right,
lowered, but are we okay? I mean, are you okay with us asking questions during your presentation, or?
I think Claudia and I had talked about we might stop midway for a few questions and then pick them up at the end just so that we can get through the material. But
Okay.
if this is related to something I've already mentioned, you could go ahead and ask.
Yeah, it was about, it got me thinking on that case with the blind student suing the community college. I wonder if, like choosing a platform like this one, like Zoom, which is very visually oriented, would be considered discrimination, as opposed to choosing a platform that is more open to anybody that would be available. Could that be considered discrimination, that we're not like, we're thinking about the majority of us visual learners, but, so I just want your input on that.
It's a good question. I think it's a difference in looking at whether the discrimination is based on which platform is used or how well the student can access what is required for the course through that platform. We will be talking a little bit in a while about universal design for learning, and I hope that might answer some of those questions. I am by no means proficient in Zoom. I use it for meetings, and of course in this case for professional development, but as far as the full accessibility requirements or what it's able to do and not do, that's not something I'm familiar with just yet. But I do think it's important to look at different modes of distributing information and interacting with students, especially in the online course environments. So we will be talking a little bit about that, and I hope some of the UDL information will address that too.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess in some ways it would be equivalent to a blind student being in a face-to-face environment, right? I mean, it's a visual world, so.
Yes, we just have to make sure that when there are curriculum requirements, the student, any student, would have access to those in a timely manner so that they can participate in an equitable way as peers without disabilities.
Now, you said it's also acceptable to provide them the material ahead of time, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And many times it would have to be provided to our office too if it needs to be converted to a different format. But that's always one of those things that we could look at on a case-by-case basis. Typically, the student would have an accommodation for alternate format in those cases.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move forward. We'll stop about midway so there's time for a few questions too. So as we look at the design of an online course, we have to take into account how students will navigate that, much of what we were just alluding to, and how they will access that online environment similar to their non-disabled peers. So key points: that design needs to be intuitive. The layout of the course should be simple, consistent, and predictable. I think about sometimes even just the way a syllabus is laid out. Does it flow? Does it make sense? Or are students having to go back and hunt for information? Maybe something in the last page of the syllabus really is more appropriately connected to something on the first page. Thinking about just intuitively, how will students interpret and learn from this information? Also, how perceivable is the content? Is it designed that it can be used by a wide range of users? And then navigable. Is it able to be navigated without assuming that students using a specific device would have, such as a mouse, they would be successful or not in being able to navigate that course? You may not think about it on a regular basis, but some students don't use a mouse as they navigate websites on their computer. They only use keyboards or other assistive technology, which we'll also be touching on. In general terms, across the United States, about 12% of college students do report having a disability. So students with all types of disabilities should be able to access their course content, and that's every format of content, whether it be verbal, video, audio, textbooks, which we talked about, even supplementary materials, with that substantial equivalent ease of use. So when you think about the students that could potentially be in your courses, you should think about individuals who are blind or have low vision, even mobility disabilities, and as I mentioned, they may be able to only use a mouse in a limited way or even have an inability to use a mouse. Students who may be deaf or hard of hearing, and then of course other disabilities that can be affected by being, let's say, connected to a computer for long periods of time. Some students with seizure disorders can have difficulty staring at a computer screen for hours at a time. And so that's also something to consider as you design your course. I mentioned assistive technology. So some students rely heavily on assistive technology, and perhaps you may as well. It really makes a difference in efficiency if it's something that you're comfortable in using. But some students do use AT to navigate websites, their online learning management systems such as Blackboard, or even other electronic course materials. So some of the examples you may or may not be familiar with would be speech recognition software, mouth sticks, eye tracking or pointing devices, and then of course I mentioned screen reader software. Screen reader software converts visual digital information, so of course everything that you're looking at on a screen, into speech. So basically it's software that reads the content to the person who's using it, reads it aloud. So yes, it's used by individuals who are blind or have limited vision, but there's other students who benefit from it as well, and it could even be a student with a reading disability. If you think about a student, for example, with dyslexia, they have great difficulty in reading content, especially large volumes of content. It may be much more accessible for them to use a screen reader, or at least an audio book or different options like that.
Miss Tanya, Miss
Yes.
Tanya, you're just hitting the question that is on my mind this morning. I know we have to wait until the end, but this is really relevant to the question or issue you're talking about. I have a student who sent me this morning. She did a quiz and she missed the 3 questions. It was just a quiz on the syllabus, and it was very simple. And then when I replied to her, I said, don't worry, everything. She said, well, I need to tell you, I have dysplasia, I have this and that, but I'm not using the disability things. What can I do with this student? Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
So I guess my question then, is the student registered with Student Accessibility Services, and does he or she have accommodations currently?
No, she did not.
So that's very unfortunate. That is very unfortunate.
Yeah.
Here we are at the end of the semester. Yes. And we will talk about our process a little bit, but just a point of emphasis is that accommodations are not retroactive. So I would definitely recommend that you refer the student to our office for supports. But even if we are to approve accommodations at this point, they would not apply retroactively, so prior to date of approval.
Dr. Tanya, this is Aziza. This is for the accelerated program. She just started module 1. Summer module 1 yesterday. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. And in those cases, I do reference later, but I might as well say it now. It's perfect timing. That as a member of the university community, anytime a student reveals that they have a disability, it's really your responsibility to refer them to our office. And I know many of you do, probably all of you, but it's preferred to do that so that we can go through our process to make sure that we're providing appropriate accommodations and that student has been identified through our processes to make sure they're a student qualified with a disability. So best practices, I think it's always really important to communicate your commitment to access and inclusion. And what does that mean? One way is the syllabus statement. But I have to say it's not enough just to have it included in your syllabus. And by the syllabus statement, what I mean is the one that's for students with disabilities. And then also there's an additional part of that statement now for students who are pregnant or seeking accommodations related to parenting. It is best practice to review that with students allowed, if possible, depending on your course structure, or in some way discuss it with them so that they're not only aware of where they need to go if they need supports and accommodations, but also that they're aware that you have a commitment to those services that can assist them because they support access. And so it's really important, I think, also for faculty to touch on access, inclusion, and even disability as being part of diversity. I think that helps that initial step that some students are hesitant to take when seeking supports. So what are the barriers to access? I thought this was an interesting article, and of course you'll be receiving these slides after the session, but I encourage you to read this. It is from Ontario, Canada, so there's a couple of different laws, but the basic understanding of accessibility is very good. The author talked about how attitudinal barriers can be one of the greatest when it comes to students' access. And of course, organizational or systemic processes. These are things that we have to evaluate at all times, even in our office. We want to make sure that if we put procedures into place, that they're not creating additional barriers for students. We want to make the process streamlined. And then architectural and physical, of course, that doesn't really apply to the online environment, but it does to face-to-face or hybrid courses. The information or communications, that has to do with our course content. So if the course content is not accessible, how can students access it readily in a timely manner? And then, of course, technological issues that can become barriers to access. Fortunately, we have lots of resources at the university, though, to help students and faculty and staff as well. So something I wanted to touch on that has come up, and this was even prior to this semester, it was at least a year ago, students started raising concerns about webcams that were being used during online testing. I completely understand why faculty need to monitor testing of students, especially when it's done remotely. We want to ensure and support test integrity. But what we were finding is that a few of our students with severe anxiety disorders, PTSD, panic disorders, they were really struggling with having webcams because sometimes the software, some of you may know this, will flag if a student is looking away from the screen too much or moving too much. And so for some of our students, that alone was increasing their anxiety so much that they weren't even able to fully function on their exams. So in a sense, something that had been implemented to ensure test integrity, which is a wonderful thing, it was indirectly creating a barrier for some of our students. I know for one student, we were able to work out an accommodation where that student would be allowed to take breaks on camera. It's because, of course, leaving the room, you're not sure what the student has access to. But just thinking about that as you're incorporating techniques and strategies into your online courses, how could this affect students with learning differences and a variety of disabilities? And I would say in those cases, if that comes up again, we just address it one-on-one and with faculty input. That's very important. Another barrier to online accessibility would be no closed captioning for educational videos, or in many cases, unfortunately, it would be inaccurate auto captioning. You're probably aware that YouTube offers automatic captioning, but it is not completely accurate. And I'm not sure what that percentage is. I've heard anything from 60 to 70% that would be accurate of the auto captioning. I'm not even sure it's always that high. So to consider that, if you're having students use YouTube videos and the auto captions, they may not be getting the same information that students who do not use those features are receiving. The other thing is improperly tagged documents. One thing that's really important is if you have any images or other parts of a document, and I'll say that could be tables, formulas, and I know there's a couple of other things that come to mind, but those require alt or alternative tags, which are descriptions of the images. Because in essence, what happens if a student is required to use a screen reader to access that information, if there's no description of an image, the screen reader literally skips past it because there's no content to read. And so those images that are just maybe for decorative purposes, they're really not necessary. And you probably notice in my presentation, I keep those kinds of things to an extreme minimum unless there's a need to include an image that would assist in conveying the information for the learning purposes of the student. The other thing is maybe using color as a sole method to communicate errors, especially as we work online, maybe highlighting something in yellow, or there might be an online form field a student had to complete and there's just a red border. For our students who have low vision or who perhaps have color blindness, color insufficiency, in those cases, they're not going to be able to pick up on those prompts because it's only color. In those cases, you would want to add some additional descriptors. Okay, let's see. How are we doing on time? Let's see. Okay, let me move through this a little quickly. One point to make related to the UTRGV accommodation process is my recommendation: faculty should not provide accommodations unless they have first been approved through SAS. The reason I say this is because I think there are many, many well-intended faculty, and they want to help our students whether they have a disability or not, and that's a wonderful thing. I mean, I just can't say that enough. But what we've seen happen over the years is that when faculty have provided and implemented academic accommodations, without those being approved through our office first in a very formalized way, then students come to expect those as they move through their courses. And then they can become very upset if they're not getting them from subsequent faculty members. It doesn't set up that future faculty member for a good experience with the student. And so we've seen that happen, I would say, semester with a few students. And it's very disappointing for the students because they say, I never had to go through this process before. I don't know why I'm having to do it now. And we realize their frustration, but we also try to help them understand that having their accommodations approved through SAS, it ensures that those accommodations will be carried forward as they're appropriate to each of their classes. I'd already mentioned accommodations are not retroactive, also a very important point. So in a nutshell, students must self-identify with a disability, and as I mentioned, if they do, please refer them to SAS. If they have what you might think is a suspected disability, you could still refer them to us and we can evaluate that. Students are required to provide documentation of their disability to our department, and then they meet with a staff member, usually one of our counseling specialists, for an interactive interview. As needed, faculty will be contacted because we want to understand the nature and requirements of a course. This is particularly the case as we move beyond lecture courses into labs, practicum experiences, field work. So in those cases, we really want to understand the curriculum requirements. We may even ask for a copy of the syllabus along with a conversation that we would have with you just for clarification. And then we have a weekly meeting of our departmental review committee where our counseling specialists bring that student's information and their request for accommodation. We evaluate it again at that level to determine if those accommodations are reasonable. We want to ensure that they do not fundamentally alter the curriculum. So that's it in a nutshell. It takes a lot more time than that explanation, of course. So along with the student's functional limitations, the need for the accommodation will depend on the structure of the online class. And as we have done this emergency move to online courses this spring, one thing that we really had to start evaluating was whether or not that online course was synchronous or asynchronous, because that makes a big difference in how some accommodations are even relevant or how they're implemented. The other thing we had to start looking at was whether or not there were synchronous components in an otherwise asynchronous class. And so sometimes that may require us to have several conversations with you as a faculty member so that we can fully understand the structure. The other thing is that accommodations are very individualized. You may see some common accommodations across a number of students. For example, one of our more common accommodations is extended time on testing. It may be time and a half, or even distraction-reduced testing environment. But for each student with that accommodation, it has been evaluated based on their disability, the functional limitations of that disability, the barriers potentially that they are encountering in that learning environment, and then of course the structure of the course. So in this case, a student had requested an accommodation to not be visible on camera during a synchronous online class. And this was a situation that actually came up in the fall. Student was participating in all online classes. And the student actually did not live here in the Valley, lived away. And so, not that that's a problem, but we start thinking about what can we do to assist the student who is fully remote learning at a distance. It was a unique request, was not one we had heard before. What we learned upon evaluating this request with the student was that the student experienced pretty significant seizures on a fairly frequent basis, and she was concerned about being visible to her class during one of the seizures, should it happen while they were on camera. And as you might expect, that could be very uncomfortable and possibly even a little uncomfortable for the peers in the class who were viewing as part of the class participation. So we worked with the student to come up with some alternatives, and we also worked with a faculty member to make sure that the student was still participating fully, as would her peers. But that, like I said, that was a very unique request, and we had lots of documentation to support that that's what was happening with this student. So testing accommodations, if you don't already know how to set extended time for online test, Colt has a wonderful faculty support FAQ, and I've pulled this directly from the website. I won't go over the steps with you, but when you go to the FAQ site that Colt has, you look for the question, how do I provide extra time on an assessment for students with disabilities? And it walks you through the steps. And of course, Colt staff are great too. If you have any trouble in setting that extra time, they'll certainly support you with that.